Tonight we uncover a mystery that has haunted the corridors of power for over 700 years. How did the Knights Templar, the most powerful military order in Christendom, transform from God's warriors into Satan's alleged servants in a single night? What really happened on that blood-soaked Friday, October 13th, 1307, when Europe's mightiest knights found themselves dragged from their beds to face torture chambers and burning stakes? Picture this, in the shadow of Notre Dame Cathedral, as bells toll midnight across Paris, torchlight flickers against stone walls. King Philip IV sits in his private chamber, his pale fingers tracing across parchments sealed with wax. Each document bears the same deadly command: arrest every Knight Templar in France. Not tomorrow, not next week. Tonight, all of them, in one coordinated strike that will shake the foundations of medieval Europe. What makes this betrayal so chilling? Just hours before these arrests, the Templars were dining in their commanderies, discussing plans for new crusades, counting their vast fortunes, completely unaware that their own king had branded them heretics. These weren't just any soldiers. These were the men who had built Europe's first international banking system, who owned more land than most kingdoms, who answered only to the Pope himself. Yet in the space of a single night, they would become hunted fugitives. This isn't just a story about the fall of an organization. It's about how power corrupts absolutely, how greed can masquerade as righteousness, and how the most sacred oaths can be shattered by politics and gold. So before you dismiss this as ancient history, ask yourself, what if the real crime of the Knights Templar wasn't heresy, but simply becoming too powerful to tolerate? Like this video and subscribe, because tonight we step into the bloodiest betrayal in medieval history, and some secrets refuse to stay buried. Imagine walking through the streets of 13th century Paris, and you'll understand why the Knights Templar inspired both awe and terror in equal measure. Their massive fortress temple dominated the city skyline, its walls rising like a mountain of dressed stone, more imposing than the royal palace itself. Inside these walls lived not hundreds, but thousands of the most disciplined warriors Europe had ever seen. Men who had sworn 3 sacred vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. Yet paradoxically, they controlled wealth that made kings weep with envy. By 1300, the Knights Templar had become something unprecedented in human history, multinational corporation disguised as a religious order. Their network stretched from the wind-swept castles of Scotland to the sun-baked fortresses of Cyprus, from the trading ports of Venice to the pilgrimage routes of Santiago de Compostela. They weren't just present in these places, they controlled them. Every major trade route in Europe passed through Templar lands. Every pilgrim who wished safe passage paid Templar fees. Every merchant who needed credit sought Templar backing. Think about the sheer scale of their empire. 15,000 knights in white mantles bearing the Red Cross. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Supporting each knight were sergeants, chaplains, craftsmen, farmers, sailors, and servants, a total workforce of nearly 150,000 people. To put that in perspective, entire kingdoms operated with smaller populations. The Templars had effectively become a state within states, a sovereign power that owed allegiance to no earthly ruler, save the Pope in Rome. Their wealth defied comprehension. In France alone, they owned over 3,000 properties, castles, farms, mills, vineyards, entire villages. In England, their holdings stretched from London's financial district to the wild borders of Scotland. They possessed fleets of ships that carried pilgrims, merchants, and cargo across the Mediterranean. Their treasure vaults in Paris held more gold and silver than the royal treasury. Some chroniclers claimed their annual income exceeded that of France and England combined. But here's what made them truly dangerous to established power. They had invented banking as we know it. A merchant in London could deposit silver with the Templars and withdraw the equivalent value in gold from their commandery in Jerusalem, all without carrying a single coin across bandit-infested roads. They issued letters of credit, managed international loans, and even provided financial services to kings. When monarchs needed money for wars or construction projects, they didn't turn to Jewish moneylenders, they went to the Knights Templar. Picture King Philip IV of France, already drowning in debt from his wars with England and Flanders. Every month, Templar accountants appeared at his palace with ledgers showing exactly how much the crown owed. The interest accumulated like a patient predator, growing larger with each passing season. Philip wasn't just in debt to the Templars, he was financially enslaved by them. They had become his creditors, and creditors have a dangerous habit of expecting repayment. The irony cuts deep when you consider their vows of poverty. Individual knights owned nothing, no personal property. No private wealth, not even the right to receive letters without their commander's permission. They ate in silence, slept in dormitories, and wore the same simple white tunic marked with the red cross. Yet collectively, the order accumulated riches that would have made Croesus weep. They justified this by claiming all wealth belonged to God and was held in trust for the holy war against Islam. Religious justification made them virtually untouchable. The Pope had granted them extraordinary privileges through a series of papal bulls. They could build their own churches, maintain their own priests, even bury their dead in sacred ground when entire kingdoms lay under interdict. They answered to no bishop, no king, no earthly authority, except the successor of St. Peter himself. This made them a law unto themselves, operating with impunity across national boundaries. Their military reputation added another layer of invincibility. These weren't ceremonial knights parading in tournaments. They were battle-tested veterans of the Crusades, trained from childhood in the arts of war. A Templar knight charged into battle with the fury of divine mission and the skill of professional soldiery. Their white mantles with red crosses struck terror into Saracen hearts from Antioch to Acre. They built castles that could withstand months-long sieges, developed new tactics for cavalry warfare, and maintained discipline that made Roman legions look chaotic. Yet success bred its own destruction. By the dawn of the 14th century, whispers followed the Templars wherever they went. Too rich, too powerful, too secretive. Their initiation ceremonies took place behind locked doors. Their chapter meetings excluded all outsiders. Even their prayers seemed different from ordinary Catholic liturgy. In an age when the Church demanded transparency from all religious orders, the Templars wrapped themselves in mysteries that invited suspicion. Common people began to fear them. Merchants resented their monopolies on trade routes. Nobles coveted their lands. Kings chafed under their independence. And in Rome, even some papal advisors wondered whether an organization that commanded more wealth than most countries might pose a threat to the established order of Christendom itself. the stage was set for catastrophe. All that remained was for someone powerful enough, desperate enough, and ruthless enough to light the fuse. That someone was already sharpening his blade in the shadows, calculating exactly how much Templar gold it would take to solve his problems. His name was Philip IV of France, and he was about to commit the greatest act of betrayal in medieval history. But the question that haunts us still remains. Were the Knights Templar destroyed because they were guilty of the horrible crimes attributed to them? Or were they destroyed simply because they had become too successful, too wealthy, too powerful for any king to tolerate? That answer lies buried in the events of a single bloody Friday that changed the course of European history forever. The winter of 1303 brought more than snow to the royal palace of France. It brought desperation. King Philip IV, known to history as Philip the Fair for his striking appearance, sat hunched over ledgers that told a story of financial ruin. The numbers stared back at him like accusers' debts that had grown beyond any hope of conventional repayment. Wars with England had drained his treasury. Conflicts in Flanders had cost him fortunes. His grand construction projects, designed to rival the glory of his grandfather St. Louis, had consumed resources faster than his kingdom could generate them. But it wasn't just any debt that haunted Philip's sleepless nights. It was debt to the Knights Templar. 400,000 livres, a sum so staggering that it represented more than France's entire annual tax revenue. Every month, Templar accountants arrived at court with their precise ledgers, their polite but insistent requests for payment, their carefully calculated interest rates that grew like cancer in the royal finances. Philip wasn't just a debtor. He was a prisoner of his own financial desperation. Picture the humiliation. Here was the King of France, supposedly the most Christian ruler in Europe, effectively owned by an organization that had started as humble warrior monks. The Templars didn't need armies to control Philip. They controlled him with numbers written in black ink on parchment. Every military campaign required their approval. Every major expenditure needed their consent. They had become the shadow government of France, and Philip knew it, yet the Templars weren't content to remain silent creditors. They began making demands that cut deeper than interest payments. They wanted influence over royal policy. They expected consultation on matters of war and peace. Some whispered they were positioning themselves to choose Philip's successor. The order that had sworn obedience to God alone was now dictating terms to the most Christian king of France. Philip's hatred grew like a slow poison. He was a proud man, descended from generations of kings who had bowed to no earthly power except the Pope. The idea that warrior monks could treat him as their debtor, their subordinate, their client, ate at his soul like acid. But hatred alone wouldn't solve his problem. He needed something more. He needed an accomplice who wore the papal crown. Enter Clement V, the man who would become Philip's most essential ally in the destruction of the Knights Templar. Born Bertrand de Goth in Gascony, Clement had never intended to become Philip's puppet. When elected Pope in 1305, he probably believed he could maintain the independence that his predecessors had fought so fiercely to preserve. But Philip had leverage over the new pontiff that went far beyond mere politics. Clement's election itself had been irregular, achieved through French influence and political maneuvering that raised questions about its validity. Philip possessed documents, correspondence, agreements promises made in the shadows before Clement's coronation that could destroy the Pope's legitimacy if revealed. More dangerously still, Philip controlled the lands where Clement had been born and where his family still lived. In medieval politics, such control represented a sword held permanently at the papal throat. The relationship between king and pope became a dance of mutual dependence and barely concealed threats. Philip needed papal authority to legitimize his planned assault on the Templars. Clement needed Philip's protection to maintain his precarious hold on the papal throne. Neither trusted the other, but both understood that their survival depended on cooperation in the destruction of Europe's most powerful military order. But Philip and Clement weren't the only enemies gathering in the shadows. Across Europe, other monarchs watched the Templars' growing power with increasing alarm. King Edward II of England owed the order massive sums and chafed under their financial influence. The Holy Roman Emperor harbored resentment over Templar privileges that allowed them to operate beyond imperial authority. Even smaller nobles, princes, and dukes had grown, weary of Templar exemptions from local laws and taxes. Templars had made a fatal mistake that all successful organizations eventually confront. They had grown too large to be ignored and too powerful to be loved. Their very success bred the resentment that would ultimately destroy them. When an organization becomes wealthier than kingdoms, more disciplined than armies, and more international than the Church itself, it inevitably becomes a target for those who feel diminished by comparison. Religious tensions added another layer to the conspiracy against the Templars. The order's secrecy had always been a source of suspicion among both clergy and lay people. Their initiation ceremonies were conducted behind locked doors. Their chapter meetings excluded all outsiders, including bishops and papal legates. They maintained their own priests, their own liturgy, their own interpretation of Christian doctrine. To many observers, this looked less like religious devotion and more like a separate religion hiding behind Christian symbols. Whispers had followed the Templars for decades. Why did their initiation involve kissing that some claimed went beyond mere ceremony? Why did they pray to a mysterious figure called Baphomet in their secret meetings? Why did their crosses sometimes appear inverted in their private chambers? Why did they seem to possess knowledge that ordinary Christians lacked? These questions had simmered beneath the surface of European consciousness for generations, waiting for someone powerful enough to transform suspicion into accusation. The final piece of the conspiracy fell into place when Philip realized that the Templars' greatest strength, their papal protection, could be turned against them. If the Pope himself could be convinced to withdraw his support, if the same papal authority that had made the Templars untouchable could be used to destroy them, then no earthly power could save them from royal vengeance. Philip began his campaign carefully, planting seeds of doubt in letters to Clement, sharing disturbing reports from former Templars, expressing grave concerns about the order's orthodoxy. He presented himself not as a greedy king seeking to escape his debts, but as a faithful Christian monarch worried about heresy within the Church's most elite military organization. The performance was masterful, and Clement, already under Philip's control, began to listen. The trap was closing, but the Templars remained oblivious to their danger. They continued to operate, as they always had, collecting rents, managing their vast financial network, preparing for a new crusade that many believed would soon be launched. Their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, even wrote to Pope Clement, proposing strategies for retaking the Holy Land, completely unaware that the Pope was already discussing his order's destruction. With the King of France by early 1307, the conspiracy was complete. Philip had his justification protecting Christianity from heresy. Clement had given his tacit approval through silence and inaction. Other European monarchs had been privately consulted and had agreed to coordinate their actions. The legal framework had been established through secret consultations with canon lawyers and theologians. All that remained was choosing the perfect moment to strike. The date would be Friday, October 13th, 1307. The charges would be heresy, blasphemy, and crimes against nature. The method would be simultaneous arrests across the entire Kingdom of France, and the result would be the complete destruction of the most powerful military organization in medieval Europe, accomplished not through battlefield defeat, but through political betrayal and manufactured scandal. Yet even as the trap prepared to spring, questions lingered in the shadows. Were Philip's accusations based on real evidence of Templar heresy? Or were they simply convenient lies designed to justify the seizure of assets that could solve the king's financial problems? The answer to that question would determine whether the destruction of the Knights Templar represented justice served or the greatest act of organized theft in European history. The document that would seal the fate of the Knights Templar was written in the darkest hours of night, its ink still wet when dawn broke over Paris on October 13th, 1307. Sealed with the royal arms of France, it contained accusations so shocking, so blasphemous, that even hardened medieval minds recoiled in horror. King Philip IV had not simply accused the Templars of financial impropriety or political overreach. He had branded them as devil-worshipping heretics who spat upon the cross of Christ and indulged in acts so vile that speaking them aloud was considered a sin. But here's what makes these charges so chilling. They were crafted with surgical precision. Each accusation struck at the deepest fears of medieval Christianity. Each claim exploited existing suspicions about the order's secrecy. Each allegation was designed not just to destroy the Templars' reputation, but to make their destruction seem like a holy crusade against Satan himself. Picture the scene in Philip's private chambers as his legal advisers constructed this devastating case. Guillaume de Nogret, the king's ruthless chancellor, sat hunched over parchments, his quill-scratching accusations that would echo through history. Beside him, canon lawyers and theologians worked to ensure that every charge aligned perfectly with existing heresy laws. They weren't just inventing crimes, they were engineering the perfect legal trap. The first and most explosive accusation struck at the very heart of Christian faith, idol worship. According to Philip's charges, the Knights Templar didn't worship Christ at all. Instead, they bowed down before a mysterious figure called Baphomet, a demonic entity depicted as a bearded head, sometimes with multiple faces, sometimes with the body of a goat. In their secret chapter meetings, the document claimed, Templars kissed this idol's feet, offered prayers to its demonic power, and promised their souls to Satan in exchange for worldly success. The name Baphomet itself was calculated to inspire maximum horror. Scholars have debated its origins for centuries. Some claim it's a corruption of Muhammad, linking the Templars to Islamic heresy. Others suggest it derives from Greek words meaning baptism of wisdom, implying secret knowledge that contradicted church teaching. But to medieval minds, the name sounded demonic, foreign, utterly opposed to Christian salvation. Imagine the impact of this accusation on ordinary believers. Here were the knights who had worn the cross into battle against Islam, who had sworn to defend Christian pilgrims, who had presented themselves as the purest warriors of Christ. Yet according to the king's charges, they had secretly served Satan all along. Their victories in the Holy Land hadn't been divine miracles, they had been rewards from the devil himself. The second major charge was even more viscerally shocking: ritual desecration of the cross. Philip's document claimed that during Templar initiation ceremonies, new brothers were forced to spit upon a crucifix, to trample it underfoot, to deny Christ 3 times in mockery of Peter's betrayal. Some versions of the charge went further, alleging that Templars urinated on crosses, struck them with swords, and spoke blasphemies so vile that witnesses dared not repeat them. This accusation exploited medieval Christianity's deepest taboo. The cross wasn't just a religious symbol, it was the physical representation of Christ's sacrifice, the holiest object in Christian worship. To desecrate a crucifix was equivalent to crucifying Christ again, a sin so absolute that it placed the perpetrator beyond any hope of forgiveness. By making this charge, Philip transformed the Templars from mere heretics into enemies of salvation itself. The third set of accusations targeted the order's most vulnerable point, their vow of celibacy and their all-male membership. Philip's charges claimed that Templar initiation involved ritual homosexual acts, that new brothers were told such behavior was not sinful within the order, and that the knights regularly engaged in unnatural vice with each other. The accusations painted Templar commanderies not as monasteries, but as dens of sexual corruption where Christian morality had been abandoned entirely. These charges were particularly devastating because they played upon existing medieval anxieties about all male religious communities. The Church had long worried about the spiritual dangers of men living together without female influence, and critics of monastic orders frequently whispered about sexual impropriety behind monastery walls. By extending these suspicions to the Templars, Philip touched a nerve that resonated across European society. The fourth major accusation was perhaps the most complex: secret initiation rituals that corrupted new members and bound them to heresy. According to the charges, Templars conducted these ceremonies in locked chambers, often at night, with rituals that bore no resemblance to Christian liturgy. New brothers were allegedly told that the Pope had no authority over them, that ordinary Christian sacraments were meaningless, and that salvation could only be achieved through Templar mysteries. These initiation charges served multiple purposes in Philip's strategy. They explained why captured Templars might claim ignorance of the order's alleged heresies. They had been gradually corrupted through secret ceremonies that slowly separated them from Orthodox Christianity. They also provided legal justification for treating all Templars as equally guilty, regardless of their individual actions or knowledge. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of Philip's accusations was how they twisted the Templars' greatest strengths into evidence of their corruption. Their wealth, it came from Satan's rewards for faithful service to evil. Their military success, it was purchased with blasphemous rituals that gave them supernatural aid. Their secrecy, It concealed crimes too horrible for Christian eyes. Their international network? It was a web of heresy spreading across Europe like a plague. The legal framework underlying these charges was equally sophisticated. Philip's lawyers had studied centuries of heresy law, identifying exactly which crimes carried the death penalty and which procedures allowed for the seizure of condemned heretics' property. They knew that accusations of idol worship, cross-desecration, and ritual sodomy would automatically trigger the most severe punishments available under canon law. More cleverly still, the charges were designed to be impossible to disprove. How could the Templars demonstrate that they hadn't worshipped Baphomet in secret ceremonies that no outsiders witnessed? How could they prove they hadn't spat on crosses during initiation rituals conducted behind locked doors? The very secrecy that had protected the order for 2 centuries now became evidence of their guilt. The timing of these accusations was equally calculated. They were released simultaneously with the arrests, giving the Templars no opportunity to prepare responses or gather evidence in their defense. By the time most knights learned what crimes they stood accused of, they were already in chains, facing interrogators who treated their guilt as established fact. Yet for all their legal sophistication, Philip's charges contained a fundamental weakness that would haunt the prosecution for years to come. They relied entirely on confessions extracted through torture, testimony from disgraced former Templars with obvious motives for revenge, and allegations so extraordinary that they strained credibility even in an age that readily believed in demonic possession and miraculous interventions. The question that would echo through 7 centuries of historical investigation remained: were these charges based on any genuine evidence of Templar heresy, or were they simply the most sophisticated character assassination in medieval history, designed to justify the seizure of assets that could solve a king's financial problems while satisfying Europe's hunger for scapegoats? As dawn broke on October 13, 1307, that question was about to be answered in the most brutal way possible, through a campaign of arrests, interrogations, and executions that would determine whether the Knights Templar died as martyrs or as the devil's own servants finally brought to justice. The bells of matins had not yet rung when the first doors splintered under iron-shod boots. Across the kingdom of France, in a coordination so precise it would have impressed Roman generals, royal sergeants moved like shadows through the pre-dawn darkness. From the great temple fortress in Paris to remote commanderies in Provence, from busy trading posts in Normandy to mountain strongholds in the Pyrenees, the same scene played out with mechanical efficiency. Armed men surrounding Templar properties, parchments bearing royal seals thrust into startled faces, and the most powerful military order in Christendom dragged from their beds in chains. This was no ordinary arrest. This was the systematic destruction of an entire organization, planned with the precision of a military campaign, and executed with the ruthlessness of a royal purge. King Philip IV had learned from previous failures against powerful enemies. This time there would be no warning, no opportunity for resistance, no chance for escape. The Knights Templar would be crushed before they even realized they were under attack. Picture the chaos in the great Temple of Paris as royal soldiers poured through gates that had never been forced before. Knights stumbled from their dormitories, pulling on robes, reaching for swords that were no longer there, confiscated in the first moments of the assault. The thunder of boots on stone echoed through corridors, where silence had once been sacred. Torchlight flickered against walls covered with the symbols of an order that in a single night had been transformed from defenders of the faith into enemies of the crown. Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Temple, was among the first to be seized. The old warrior who had planned new crusades just days before found himself hauled before Guillaume de Nogret, Philip's merciless chancellor, and presented with charges that must have seemed like the ravings of a madman. Idol worship, blasphemy, sexual perversion. These accusations against an order that had shed its blood for Christ in the Holy Land struck even hardened medieval minds as almost incomprehensible. Yet the speed and coordination of the arrests revealed months of careful planning. Every major Templar commandery had been surveilled, every knight's routine studied, every possible escape route blocked. Royal sergeants possessed detailed lists of names, accurate maps of Templar properties, and specific instructions about which prisoners were to be treated with special care, meaning those most likely to possess vital information about the order's secrets and treasures. Numbers tell their own story of the operation's scope. In Paris alone, 138 knights were arrested in a single sweep. Across France, estimates suggest between 600 and 2,000 Templars were seized that night, from the most senior commanders to humble serving brothers. This wasn't a targeted arrest of suspected heretics. It was the wholesale imprisonment of every member of the order Philip's men could lay hands on. But here's where the mystery deepens into something that still puzzles historians today. When the royal sergeants broke open the temple's treasury, expecting to find the legendary Templar wealth that could solve France's financial crisis, they discovered something that must have left them staring in disbelief. The vaults were empty. Not just depleted or partially emptied, completely, utterly empty, as if centuries of accumulated treasure had simply vanished into thin air. Imagine the shock. Philip's entire strategy had been built on seizing Templar assets to pay his debts and fund his government. His legal justification for the arrests was heresy, but his practical motivation was financial salvation. Yet when his men pried open coffers that should have contained mountains of gold and silver, they found nothing but dust and shadows. The treasury that had bankrolled kings and financed crusades had disappeared as completely as if it had never existed. Where had it gone? The question haunted Philip's ministers and has fascinated historians ever since. Some evidence suggests the treasure had been moved days or even weeks before the arrests, spirited away to unknown locations by knights who somehow learned of the planned betrayal. Other theories propose that the Templars' famous fleet, anchored at their stronghold of La Rochelle, had sailed into the night carrying the order's wealth to safety in foreign lands. The most tantalizing possibility is that Templar sympathizers within Philip's own court had warned the order of their impending doom. The coordination required to empty multiple treasuries across France would have needed advance notice and careful planning. Someone with access to royal secrets had betrayed the betrayer, allowing at least some of the Templars' assets to escape Philip's grasp. But if the treasure had been moved, it had been done with such skill that no trace remained. Royal investigators found no carts marked with suspicious wheel ruts, no ship's manifests recording unusual cargo, no witnesses willing to testify about midnight processions carrying chests of gold. The Templar wealth had vanished as efficiently as the order itself was being Destroyed Dot, the arrested knights themselves seemed genuinely stunned by both the accusations and the speed of their downfall. Many had gone to sleep as respected members of Christendom's most elite military order and awakened as accused heretics facing torture and death. The psychological shock must have been overwhelming, like discovering that everything you believed about your life, your mission, your sacred vows, was suddenly considered evidence of demonic corruption. Contemporary accounts described knights weeping openly as the charges were read to them, not from fear of punishment, but from the sheer impossibility of the accusations. Men who had dedicated their lives to defending Christianity found themselves branded as Satan's servants. Warriors who had bled for the cross were accused of spitting upon it. Monks who had sworn celibacy faced charges of sexual depravity. The timing of the arrests had been calculated for maximum psychological impact. Friday the 13th was already considered an unlucky day in medieval superstition, but Philip's choice went deeper than mere symbolism. It was the day after the feast of St. Edward the Confessor, when many Templars would have received communion, making the subsequent accusations of blasphemy even more jarring. It was also deep enough into October that winter weather would soon make escape or rescue attempts virtually impossible. Regional commanders across France reported similar scenes as the arrests spread beyond Paris. In Normandy, knights were dragged from their prayers at dawn. In Burgundy, entire commanderies were surrounded and sealed before their inhabitants knew they were under attack. In the south, near the Spanish border, some knights apparently received warning and fled across the mountains, but they were exceptions in what was otherwise a perfectly executed trap. The efficiency of the operation revealed the depth of Philip's intelligence network within the Templar organization. His agents knew exactly which doors to break down, which chambers to search, which brothers held the most sensitive positions. This wasn't the blundering assault of a desperate king. It was the surgical strike of a ruler who had studied his enemy with the patience of a spider watching flies. Yet for all its tactical success, Philip's great betrayal had failed in its primary objective. The king had captured the knights, but the treasure that was supposed to solve his financial crisis remained tantalizingly out of reach. He had destroyed the order's structure, but its wealth had slipped through his fingers like water through a sieve dot as the sun rose over Paris on that infamous Friday morning, revealing a city where the most powerful military order in Europe had been reduced to chained prisoners in a single night. One question echoed through the corridors of power. Philip had won the battle, but had he lost the war? The Templars were his prisoners, but their secrets and their gold remained free. And in the darkness of dungeon cells across France, as shocked and bewildered knights tried to comprehend the magnitude of their fall, another question began to take shape, one that would haunt the next 7 years of trials and torture. Were they innocent victims of political greed, or had their secret sins finally been exposed to the light of divine justice? In the stone dungeons beneath Paris, where daylight never penetrated and screams echoed off damp walls, Guillaume de Nogret perfected the art of breaking human souls. Philip's chancellor had learned his craft during years of legal persecution against Pope Boniface VIII, but the Templar investigation would become his masterpiece of judicial torture. This wasn't random brutality, it was systematic psychological and physical destruction, designed to extract confessions that would justify the greatest seizure. of wealth in medieval history. Picture the scene in those underground chambers. Chains hanging from walls, stained with centuries of suffering. Instruments of torture, arranged with the precision of a surgeon's tools. And in the center, bound to wooden frames or suspended by their wrists, the knights who had once been Christendom's most elite warriors. Men who had faced Saracen swords, without flinching, now found themselves confronting an enemy. They had never imagined their own king's systematic campaign to destroy their sanity. Nogrit's methods were sophisticated beyond mere physical pain. He understood that the Templars' greatest strength, their absolute faith in their sacred mission, could be turned into their greatest weakness. The interrogations began not with hot irons or breaking wheels, but with psychological warfare designed to shatter the knight's understanding of reality itself. Imagine being dragged into one of those chambers, still reeling from the shock of arrest, and having a royal prosecutor read you detailed confessions allegedly signed by your own brothers. Documents describing how your Grand Master had admitted to spitting on the cross. Testimonies claiming your closest friends had confessed to worshiping demons. Statements suggesting that everything you believed about your order's holiness had been a lie, perpetrated by heretical leaders. The genius of this approach lay in its use of isolation and misinformation. Each prisoner was told that all the others had already confessed, that resistance was pointless, that only cooperation could save them from burning at the stake. Knights who might have died before betraying their brothers were convinced that their brothers had already betrayed them. The bonds of loyalty that had held the order together for 2 centuries were systematically dissolved by lies whispered in dungeon. Darkness. When psychological pressure proved insufficient, Nogrit's men escalated to physical torture with methodical precision. The strappato was a favorite technique. Prisoners hoisted by ropes tied to their wrists behind their backs, then dropped suddenly to dislocate shoulders and tear muscles. The agony was excruciating, but it left no permanent marks that might invalidate confessions extracted through its use. Fire became another tool in the interrogator's arsenal. Not the dramatic pyres that would later consume unrepentant knights, but carefully applied flames that burned just enough to cause unbearable pain without killing. Feet were roasted slowly over braziers until the flesh separated from bone. Brands were pressed against sensitive areas of the body. The smell of burning human flesh became as common in those dungeons as incense in a cathedral. The rack stretched joints beyond their natural limits, producing sounds that witnesses described as worse than the screams, the wet pops of bones separating, the grinding of cartilage being torn apart. Some knights emerged from these sessions permanently crippled, unable to walk without assistance, their warrior bodies transformed into testimonies to royal justice. But perhaps the cruelest torture was reserved for the order's priests and intellectuals, men whose minds had been their greatest weapons. Sleep deprivation drove them to hallucinations. Starvation reduced proud warriors to begging for scraps. Sensory isolation in completely dark cells, sometimes for weeks at a time, shattered their ability to distinguish between reality and nightmare. The confessions that emerged from these sessions followed remarkably similar patterns, too similar to be coincidental. Knights admitted to being shown a mysterious head during initiation and being told to worship it. They described being forced to spit on a crucifix and deny Christ 3 times. They confessed to ritual homosexual acts and to being told that such behavior was not sinful within the order. These consistencies weren't proof of the charges' truth. They were evidence of the interrogators' efficiency. Nogret's men had developed standardized scripts for the confessions they wanted to extract. Prisoners who deviated from these templates faced renewed torture until their testimonies aligned with the prosecution's narrative. The psychological damage often proved more lasting than the physical wounds. Knights who had spent decades in absolute certainty about their sacred mission found themselves signing documents that made them complicit in their order's destruction. The guilt of betraying their brothers, even under torture, haunted many survivors for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, Pope Clement V found himself trapped in an impossible position. As head of the Universal Church, he possessed theoretical authority over all religious orders, including the Templars. Yet Philip's fait accompli had left him with no practical options. The knights were already imprisoned, their confessions already extracted, their order already destroyed in all but name. Clement's initial response revealed both his political weakness and his moral conflict. He issued bulls demanding that Philip turn over the prisoners to papal custody, knowing full well that the French king would ignore these commands. He proclaimed that only the Pope could judge a religious order's orthodoxy, while simultaneously acknowledging the disturbing reports that Philip had shared about Templar heresy. The Pope's dilemma deepened when other European monarchs began their own arrests. Edward II of England, initially reluctant to move against the Templars, eventually succumbed to papal and French pressure. German princes seized Templar properties across the Holy Roman Empire. Even traditionally Templar-friendly kingdoms like Portugal and Aragon found themselves forced to take action against the order. Each new wave of arrests provided fresh opportunities for torture and confession. English Templars, subjected to less systematic brutality than their French brothers, initially maintained their innocence more consistently. This created diplomatic tensions between London and Paris, with Philip demanding that Edward increase the pressure on his prisoners. The legal framework underlying these proceedings was equally corrupt. Canon law theoretically required multiple independent witnesses to sustain heresy charges, but Nogret's prosecutors argued that the secretive nature of Templar crimes made such evidence impossible to obtain. Instead, they relied almost exclusively on confessions, extracted through torture confessions that the same legal system normally considered invalid if obtained through coercion. The trials themselves became theatrical performances rather than judicial proceedings. Prisoners were brought before tribunals of bishops and inquisitors who had already decided their guilt. Questions were designed not to establish facts, but to confirm predetermined conclusions. Defense advocates were either intimidated into silence or excluded entirely from the proceedings. Some knights attempted to recant their confessions once removed from immediate torture. These brave souls faced immediate return to the dungeons for additional questioning that invariably produced renewed admissions of guilt. The message was clear: confess and live at least temporarily, or maintain innocence and suffer unimaginably. Yet despite the systematic nature of the persecution, cracks began to appear in Philip's perfect prosecution. Too many confessions were obviously scripted. Too many knights bore visible signs of torture that contradicted official claims about their voluntary cooperation. Too many inconsistencies emerged between testimonies supposedly given independently. International observers, particularly from kingdoms that had maintained better relations with the Templars, began expressing doubts about the French charges. Scholars noted that identical accusations had been leveled against Jews, Cathars, and other groups that powerful interests wanted to destroy. The specificity of the charges, always the same rituals, always the same demonic practices, suggested fabrication rather than genuine. Investigation died as the trials dragged on year after year. Public opinion began to shift. What had initially seemed like divine justice against heretical knights increasingly appeared to be royal greed, disguised as religious righteousness. The very efficiency of Nagrit's torture machine became evidence of its corrupt purpose, but the damage was done. The confessions existed on parchment, signed with trembling hands and sealed with royal approval. The order's reputation was destroyed beyond repair, and in dungeons across Europe, knights who had once been history's most powerful warriors waited to learn whether their remaining choice was between the executioner's fire or permanent imprisonment in chains. The question that haunted those dark cells was no longer whether the Templars were guilty of the crimes charged against them. Torture had already provided whatever confessions the prosecutors demanded. The real question was whether any justice system that relied on such methods could claim legitimacy, and whether the destruction of the Knights Templar represented the triumph of law or its complete corruption. 7 years of trials, torture, and political maneuvering came to their bloody climax on a small island in the Seine River, where 2 old men prepared to die for crimes they had spent their final years denying. The date was March 18, 1314. The place was Isle aux Juifs, a narrow strip of land between the royal palace and the cathedral of Notre Dame. The condemned were Jacques de Mallet, last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, and Geoffroy de Charny, preceptor of Normandy, the 2 highest-ranking survivors of an order that had once commanded the respect of kings and the fear of infidels. But this execution would be unlike any other in medieval history. What should have been the final triumph of King Philip IV over his enemies became instead a moment that would haunt European consciousness for centuries. Because as the flames began to lick at his feet, the old Grand Master would utter words that transformed his death from mere judicial punishment into prophecy, a curse that seemed to reach beyond the grave, to drag his persecutors into damnation alongside him. Picture the scene as twilight gathered over Paris. The island had been prepared like a stage for royal theater. Wooden platforms surrounded the execution site, filled with nobles, clergymen, and curious citizens who had come to witness the end of the most mysterious military order in Christendom. King Philip himself watched from a balcony of his palace, close enough to see every detail of his enemies' final moments, but distant enough to maintain royal dignity. The 2 condemned men were led onto the island in chains, their white Templar mantles replaced by the gray robes of penitent heretics. Yet something in their bearing surprised the assembled crowd. After 7 years of imprisonment, torture, and degradation, they walked with the upright posture of knights rather than the shuffle of broken criminals. Their eyes held not the glazed despair of defeated men, but the hard clarity of warriors who had found peace with their fate. The charges were read one final time, though by now everyone present could recite them from memory. idol worship, blasphemy against Christ, sexual perversion, heretical teachings. The litany of accusations that had justified the order's destruction echoed across the water, each word carrying the weight of 7 years of legal proceedings and countless hours of extracted confessions. But then something unexpected happened. As the executioner prepared to light the pyres, Jacques de Molay raised his voice in what witnesses described as the strongest, clearest tone he had managed in years of imprisonment. The old man, who had supposedly confessed to every imaginable sin against Christianity, now recanted everything, declaring before God and the assembled multitude that he and his order were innocent of all charges. Imagine the shock that rippled through the crowd. Here was a man about to be burned alive, with nothing left to gain from lies and everything to lose from truth, proclaiming his order's righteousness with his final breath. Geoffroy de Charny joined his Grand Master in this ultimate act of defiance, his voice carrying across the Seine as he too denied the confessions that torture had wrung from his lips. The two men's final statements struck like thunderbolts at the foundation of Philip's entire case. If the highest-ranking Templars maintained their innocence even facing death, what did that say about the confessions that had condemned their brothers? If torture and 7 years of imprisonment couldn't break their fundamental loyalty to their order's sacred mission, were they fanatics or martyrs? Philip's officials found themselves in an impossible position. The executions had been planned as the culmination of legal proceedings, the final proof that justice had been served against heretical knights. Instead, they were becoming demonstrations that the condemned men believed themselves to be dying for their faith, rather than for their crimes. The Grand Master's words grew even more powerful as the flames began to rise around him. According to multiple contemporary accounts, Jacques de Molay raised his eyes toward the royal palace, where Philip watched, and spoke words that would echo through history. God knows the truth of our innocence, and the truth will be revealed. Before God and man, I declare the order of the Temple innocent of the crimes laid upon us. But I say to you, Philip, King of France, and to you, Clement, Pope of Rome, that within this year you shall both be called to answer before the throne of the Almighty for this injustice. The curse struck the assembled crowd like a physical blow. In an age when most people believe absolutely in divine justice and supernatural retribution, the Grand Master's words carried terrifying weight. This wasn't merely the angry rant of a condemned criminal. It was a formal appeal to heaven's court from a man who claimed to be dying innocent of the charges against him. Geoffroy de Charny's final words were equally chilling. The old preceptor spoke of seeing his dead brothers waiting for him beyond the flames, of knowing that truth would outlive the lies that had destroyed their order. He prophesied that the Templars' persecutors would find no peace in this life or the next, that divine vengeance would pursue them until justice was satisfied. The execution itself became a gruesome spectacle that horrified even medieval sensibilities accustomed to public violence. The two knights refused the traditional mercy of strangulation before burning, choosing instead to die conscious in the flames. Witnesses described how they continued to pray loudly, even as fire consumed their bodies, their voices audible above the crackling of wood and the roar of flames. But it was what happened after the executions that truly terrified contemporaries and gave the Grand Master's curse its legendary power. Within weeks, strange reports began circulating through Paris and across Europe. Pope Clement V, who had been in declining health for months, suddenly worsened dramatically. By April 20th, just over a month after the executions, he was dead, reportedly suffering from a mysterious wasting disease that physicians couldn't explain or treat. The Pope's death might have been coincidental, but what followed strained even medieval credulity. King Philip IV, seemingly in perfect health despite his 46 years, began experiencing bizarre accidents and ailments. He fell from his horse during hunts with increasing frequency. He suffered from nightmares that left him screaming in the night. Court physicians reported strange symptoms that defied their medical knowledge. By November of 1314, exactly 8 months after Jacques de Mailly's execution, Philip IV was dead. The official cause was listed as a stroke suffered during a hunting expedition, but rumors spread like wildfire through European courts. The King of France had been called to divine judgment, just as the Grand Master had prophesied. The curse had claimed both its intended victims within the promised year. The psychological impact of these deaths on medieval Europe cannot be overstated. Common people who had initially supported Philip's action against the Templars began to whisper that divine justice had intervened. Nobles who had profited from the seizure of Templar lands started making donations to the church, seeking to expiate their complicity in what increasingly seemed like judicial murder rather than righteous prosecution. Even more disturbing were the reports that began emerging from across Europe about supernatural occurrences connected to the Templar persecution. Former Templar properties were said to be haunted by the ghosts of executed knights. Witnesses claimed to see spectral figures in white mantles walking the corridors of commanderies that had been converted to other uses. Some former interrogators and prosecutors reported being visited in dreams by their victims, warning of divine retribution that awaited all who had participated in the order's destruction. The curse seemed to extend beyond its original targets. Philip's entire dynasty would be extinct within 14 years of the executions, his 3 sons dying without male heirs in a series of deaths that contemporaries attributed to the Grand Master's supernatural vengeance. The Capetian line that had ruled France for over 3 centuries ended in mysterious circumstances that historians still debate today. But perhaps the most significant impact of Jacques de Mailly's final defiance was how it transformed historical memory of the Templar persecution. What Philip had intended as the definitive proof of his justice became instead the foundation for centuries of legends about innocent knights destroyed by greedy kings and corrupt popes. The Grand Master's dying words became the seed from which countless conspiracy theories, romantic legends, and esoteric traditions would grow, standing on that island in the Seine as twilight deepened into night, watching 2 old men burn for crimes they denied with their final breath. The assembled crowd witnessed more than an execution. They saw the birth of a legend that would outlive both the accusers and the accused, a story that would inspire everything from Masonic rituals to modern novels about ancient conspiracies. The fire that consumed Jacques de Mailly and Geoffroy de Charny was meant to end the story of the Knights Templar. Instead, it began their transformation from defeated military order into eternal symbol of resistance against corrupt authority. The curse that the Grand Master hurled into the night would echo through history, reminding future generations that sometimes the greatest victory belongs not to those who wield power, but to those who die rather than surrender their truth. Strip away the dramatic accusations of devil worship and blasphemy. Peel back the layers of medieval legal proceedings and religious rhetoric, and the destruction of the Knights Templar reveals itself as one of history's most sophisticated acts of state-sponsored theft. While Philip IV wrapped his persecution in the sacred language of protecting Christianity from heresy, the cold mathematics of royal finance tell a different story entirely. This wasn't about saving souls, it was about saving a bankrupt kingdom from financial collapse. The numbers alone expose the lie behind Philip's pious justifications. 400,000 livres. That was the sum that haunted the French king's nightmares, the debt to the Knights Templar that had grown like a cancer in the royal treasury. To put this astronomical figure in perspective, it represented more than France's entire annual tax revenue. It was equivalent to the cost of building dozens of cathedrals or funding a major crusade for multiple years. Most devastating of all, it was a debt that grew larger every month through compound interest, managed by Templar accountants who kept meticulous records of every livre owed. Picture the humiliation. Philip IV, who styled himself the most Christian king of France, heir to St. Louis, and defender of the faith, had become little more than a debtor to the very organization he would later brand as Satan's servants. Every military campaign required Templar approval. Every major expenditure needed their financial backing. The kingdom that had once been the sword of Christendom now danced to tunes played by warrior monks, who answered to no earthly authority save the Pope. But the debt was only the most visible symptom of a deeper problem that threatened the very foundation of medieval monarchy. The Templars had evolved into something unprecedented and dangerous, a sovereign power that operated within European kingdoms, but answered to none of them. They maintained their own armies, controlled their own territories, issued their own currency, and conducted their own foreign policy. In effect, they had become a state within states, a parallel government that competed with royal authority at every level. Consider the scope of their independence. When King Edward I of England needed money for his wars in Scotland, he didn't turn to English nobles or merchants. He negotiated with Templar financiers who treated crowned heads as just another category of client. When disputes arose over trade routes or territorial boundaries, Templar commanders often held more sway than royal officials. Their network of commanderies stretched across Europe like a spider's web, each one connected to the others by coded letters and shared loyalties that transcended national boundaries. This autonomy would have been tolerable when the Templars were distant crusaders fighting infidels in the Holy Land, but by 1300 the last Christian strongholds in Palestine had fallen, leaving the order without its founding mission. Instead of dissolving or redirecting their efforts, the Templars had simply turned their formidable organizational skills toward accumulating even more wealth and influence in Europe itself. They were no longer crusading knights, they were a medieval multinational corporation with private armies. The political implications terrified monarchs across Europe. How could kings claim absolute authority when warrior monks owned vast territories within their realms, yet owed allegiance only to Rome? How could royal justice function when Templars could claim ecclesiastical immunity from secular courts? How could national armies maintain their monopoly on organized violence when the Templars fielded better trained, better equipped forces that could potentially threaten royal power? Philip's financial crisis had exposed these deeper tensions. His wars with England and Flanders had revealed the limits of traditional royal revenue. Feudal obligations could provide soldiers, but not the sustained funding needed for prolonged campaigns. Tax collection remained primitive and inefficient. The only source of reliable credit was the Templars, and that credit came with strings attached that effectively subordinated royal policy to Templar interests. The king's desperation becomes clear when you examine his previous attempts to solve his financial problems. He had debased the currency repeatedly, earning himself the nickname the counterfeiter from angry merchants. He had expelled Jews from France and seized their property, gaining temporary relief but losing valuable financial expertise. He had imposed crushing taxes on the clergy, provoking conflicts with the Pope that weakened his international standing. Each desperate measure had provided short-term funds while creating long-term problems that made his situation worse. By 1307, Philip faced a perfect storm of financial and political pressures. His debts continued to grow while his credit dried up. His nobles grumbled about taxes while demanding military action against England. His merchants complained about monetary instability while his clergy resisted further exactions. The Templars alone seemed immune to his problems, sitting on their vast wealth like dragons guarding hoards of gold. The beauty of the heresy charges becomes apparent when viewed through this lens of financial desperation. Canon law provided convenient mechanisms for seizing the property of condemned heretics. If the Templars could be branded as devil worshippers, their entire fortune would legally revert to the crown. More importantly, their debts to the order would be nullified. You can't owe money to an organization that has been proven to serve Satan. Philip's choice of specific accusations was equally calculated. Devil worship and blasphemy were crimes so heinous that they automatically triggered the death penalty under ecclesiastical law. Sexual perversion added visceral disgust to legal condemnation. Secret rituals explained why these alleged crimes had never been detected before. Each charge was designed to make the Templars' destruction seem not just legally justified, but morally imperative. The international scope of the persecution reveals its political dimensions. Philip couldn't simply seize Templar property in France while allowing the order to continue operating elsewhere that would have invited military retaliation from Templar forces based in other kingdoms. The systematic campaign to convince other European monarchs to arrest their own Templars was essential to preventing the order from regrouping beyond French borders. Yet even kings who initially resisted Philip's pressure eventually succumbed to the same logic that had driven his persecution. Edward II of England initially refused to arrest the Templars, but mounting debts and papal pressure eventually forced his compliance. German princes discovered that Templar accusations provided convenient excuses for seizing valuable properties. Even traditionally Templar-friendly rulers found it impossible to resist the combination of financial temptation and religious justification that Philip had pioneered. The Pope's role in this conspiracy exposes the complete corruption of the persecution's religious pretenses. Clement V was never a free agent in these proceedings. He was Philip's political prisoner, dependent on French protection for his personal safety and papal authority. His initial protests about proper ecclesiastical procedures quickly gave way to passive cooperation once Philip made clear that papal independence was negotiable. The systematic nature of the torture and trials reveals how little the persecution had to do with genuine concern about heresy. Real investigations into religious crimes would have focused on gathering evidence and establishing facts. Instead, Philip's prosecutors worked backward from predetermined conclusions, using torture to extract confessions that matched their needs rather than seeking truth about Templar practices. The convenient timing of the accusations coming precisely when Philip's financial crisis reached its peak exposes the mercenary motives behind the religious rhetoric. The Templars weren't destroyed because they had suddenly become more heretical, but because they had become too financially powerful to tolerate and too politically independent to control. Perhaps most damaging to Philip's claims of religious motivation is what happened to the Templar wealth after their condemnation. Instead of being dedicated to holy purposes like funding new crusades or building churches, the seized assets were immediately applied to paying royal debts and funding secular government operations. The treasure that had supposedly been contaminated by Satan's influence proved perfectly acceptable for French royal use. The destruction of the Knights Templar stands as one of history's most successful confidence games, a massive theft disguised as religious purification, political consolidation masquerading as spiritual reform. Philip IV managed to eliminate his creditors, seize their assets, escape his debts, and enhance his authority while convincing much of Europe that he was performing a sacred duty. Yet the very success of this deception created its own problems. If warrior monks could be destroyed through manufactured accusations, what protection did any powerful organization have against royal greed? If papal authority could be subordinated to political convenience, what happened to the Church's independence? If torture-extracted confessions could justify the seizure of entire fortunes, what security did property rights possess? The precedent established by the Templar persecution would echo through European history for centuries, inspiring similar attacks on other wealthy organizations whenever monarchs faced financial crises. The techniques Philip pioneered, combining religious hysteria with legal sophistication, international coordination with domestic propaganda, became the standard playbook for authoritarian rulers seeking to eliminate inconvenient institutions. But perhaps the greatest irony is that Philip's victory proved temporary, while the Templars achieved a form of immortality. The French king solved his immediate financial problems, but doomed his dynasty to extinction within a generation. The order he destroyed became a legend that has inspired countless books, movies, and conspiracy theories. In trying to erase the Templars from history, Philip IV guaranteed that they would be remembered forever, not as heretics who deserved destruction, but as martyrs who died for principles that transcended royal greed. Behind the smoke of burning pyres and the screams of tortured knights lies a question that has haunted scholars for 7 centuries. Were the Knights Templar destroyed for crimes they actually committed, or were they hiding something so valuable that it justified their complete annihilation? The official narrative speaks of manufactured charges and royal greed, but whispers persist in ancient manuscripts and coded symbols that suggest a deeper truth. that the order possessed knowledge so dangerous it could shake the foundations of medieval Christianity itself. Consider the mysteries that surrounded the Templars long before Philip IV branded them heretics. Their initiation ceremonies were conducted in absolute secrecy, even from bishops and papal legates who theoretically possessed authority over all religious orders. Their chapter meetings excluded everyone except full knights, creating an inner circle within an inner circle. Most intriguingly, their rapid rise from humble warrior monks to Europe's most powerful organization seemed to defy conventional explanations of medieval success. The order's founding story itself raises questions that historians struggle to answer satisfactorily. 9 knights sworn to poverty somehow convinced the king of Jerusalem to grant them quarters on the Temple Mount, the most sacred site in Christianity. For nearly a decade they conducted excavations beneath the ruins of Solomon's Temple, ostensibly searching for relics, but finding nothing that official records acknowledge. Yet when they finally emerged from those underground chambers, they possessed wealth, influence, and knowledge that would transform them into medieval Europe's first multinational organization. What did they discover in those buried chambers? Conventional historians dismiss the question as unanswerable, but fragmentary evidence suggests the Templars may have uncovered something far more significant than gold or silver. Contemporary accounts describe mysterious scrolls, ancient maps, and artifacts that the knights guarded more carefully than their military treasures. Some chronicles mention strange rituals that bore little resemblance to Orthodox Christian liturgy, practices that seemed to draw from far older traditions than the Crusades. The architectural legacy of the Templars provides tantalizing clues about their possible secret knowledge. Templar churches across Europe share distinctive features that have puzzled scholars for centuries: octagonal designs that echo Islamic architecture, astronomical alignments that suggest advanced knowledge of celestial mechanics, and proportional relationships that mirror those found in ancient Egyptian temples. These weren't random design choices by medieval masons. They represented a coherent, symbolic language that spoke to initiates while remaining invisible to outsiders. Perhaps most intriguingly, Templar structures often contained hidden chambers and secret passages that serve no obvious military or administrative purpose. The preceptory at Chenin in France conceals underground rooms decorated with symbols that blend Christian, Islamic, and pre-Christian imagery. The Temple Church in London features carvings that seem to reference Hermetic traditions predating Christianity by centuries. These architectural mysteries suggest that the Templars possessed knowledge that extended far beyond conventional medieval learning. The Order's financial innovations provide another window into their possible secrets. The Templars didn't simply invent banking, they revolutionized it with techniques that wouldn't become widespread until the Renaissance. Their credit systems, accounting methods, and international monetary transfers displayed sophistication that historians struggle to explain through conventional medieval sources. Did they develop these innovations independently, or did they discover ancient texts that described economic principles unknown to their contemporaries? But the most compelling evidence for Templar secrets lies not in what they built or wrote, but in what happened when they were destroyed. The speed with which their treasure vanished suggests advanced planning that required either supernatural foresight or inside knowledge of Philip's intentions, a coordination required to empty multiple treasuries across France while maintaining absolute secrecy, points to communication networks and contingency, plans that went far beyond normal military organization. The Church's initial silence about the Templar accusations becomes more significant when viewed through this lens of hidden knowledge. Pope Clement V's hesitation to act against the order wasn't simply political calculation. It may have reflected awareness that the Templars possessed information that could prove embarrassing or dangerous to ecclesiastical authority. Documents that have surfaced in Vatican archives suggest that some papal advisors feared the order might possess alternative gospels, Gnostic texts, or historical records that contradicted official church teachings. The international scope of Templar escape networks suggests preparation that began years before the actual persecution. Too many knights managed to disappear from countries across Europe for these to be random individual flights. The order's maritime capabilities, centered on their fleet at La Rochelle, provided the infrastructure for coordinated evacuations that official histories acknowledge but cannot fully explain. Where did these ships go, and what cargo did they carry beyond mere refugees? The Scotland connection offers perhaps the most intriguing possibility for Templar survival and secret preservation. Robert the Bruce's excommunication for murdering his rival in a church created a natural alliance with knights fleeing papal persecution. The Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 features mysterious cavalry units that helped secure Scottish independence units that appeared suddenly, fought with devastating effectiveness, and disappeared from historical records immediately afterward. Were these the remnants of the Templar order, fighting one last battle under a different banner? Archaeological evidence from Scotland supports this theory. Rosslyn Chapel, built by the St. Clair family generations after the Templars' official destruction, contains stone carvings that seem to reference Templar symbolism, Masonic imagery, and even New World plants that Europeans weren't supposed to encounter until Columbus. The precision of these carvings suggests access to knowledge sources that mainstream history cannot adequately explain. The order's alleged connections to ancient mystery schools raise even more provocative questions. Medieval accounts describe Templar contact with Islamic scholars, Coptic monks, and Jewish Kabbalists during their decades in the Holy Land. These groups possessed textual traditions that preserved pre-Christian philosophical and scientific knowledge. Did the Templars acquire manuscripts, techniques, or initiatory secrets that gave them access to wisdom that European Christianity had deliberately suppressed? The persistence of Templar symbolism in later esoteric traditions suggests that something survived the order's official destruction. Masonic rituals reference Templar imagery with surprising specificity. Rosicrucian texts claim descent from Templar survivors. Even modern conspiracy theories about secret societies inevitably trace their origins back to knights who supposedly preserved ancient wisdom through centuries of persecution. While these connections are often exaggerated or fabricated, the consistent pattern suggests that some authentic Templar knowledge may have been transmitted through underground channels. Yet the most disturbing possibility is that the Templars' real secret wasn't ancient wisdom at all, but rather evidence of the Church's own corruption and contradictions. Their years in the Holy Land had exposed them to Christian communities that preserved traditions predating Catholic orthodoxy. They had witnessed the political machinations behind papal policy. They possessed financial records that documented ecclesiastical corruption on an unprecedented scale. Perhaps their greatest crime wasn't heresy, but rather their potential to expose the gap between Christian ideals and church reality. The order's emphasis on literacy and record-keeping means that whatever secrets they possessed were likely preserved in written form. The systematic destruction of Templar libraries during the persecution suggests that Philip and Clement feared documents as much as they feared armed resistance. What did those burned manuscripts contain? Were they simply administrative records, or did they include texts that could have revolutionized medieval understanding of Christianity's origins and development? The geographic distribution of Templar survival stories provides additional clues about their secret knowledge. Portugal, where the order was reconstituted as the Knights of Christ, became a center of maritime exploration that discovered lands that Templar maps may have already described. Switzerland, where some theorists placed Templar refugees, developed banking traditions that echo the order's financial innovations. Scotland, the alleged destination of their fleet, preserved architectural and ritual traditions that seem to reference Templar symbolism. Modern DNA analysis of remains from Templar sites has revealed surprising diversity in the Knights' ethnic origins, suggesting recruitment networks that extended far beyond Western Europe. Some skeletons show evidence of diseases endemic to the Middle East, confirming extended residence in the Holy Land. Others display dental modifications associated with specific regional traditions. These findings support theories that the Templars maintained active relationships with diverse knowledge communities throughout their existence. The question of Templar secrets ultimately comes down to whether you believe that historical conspiracies can preserve knowledge across centuries of persecution. Mainstream historians generally argue that medieval organizations lacked the sophistication to maintain long-term secrecy about genuinely significant discoveries. But the evidence of coordinated escape plans, persistent symbolism, and continuing influence suggests that the Knights Templar may have been far more than simple warrior monks who fell victim to royal greed. Whether they possessed ancient wisdom, alternative Christian traditions, or simply evidence of ecclesiastical corruption, the Templars clearly guarded knowledge that their enemies considered dangerous enough to justify complete destruction. The fact that their secrets, whatever they were, may have survived their persecution adds a final layer of mystery to one of history's most enigmatic organizations. The ashes of Jacques de Molay had barely cooled when the vultures descended upon the carcass of the Knights Templar. Across Europe, kings, nobles, and churchmen who had watched the order's destruction with carefully concealed anticipation now emerged from the shadows to claim their shares of the greatest fortune seizure in medieval history. What followed was not justice or divine retribution, but the most cynical redistribution of wealth the continent had ever witnessed, a feeding frenzy that would reshape European politics for centuries to come. Pope Clement V, despite his role in the Templars' persecution, found himself facing an impossible dilemma as the order's theoretical heir. Canon law dictated that the property of dissolved religious organizations should revert to the Church, but Philip IV had no intention of handing over assets he had murdered to obtain. The resulting negotiations between papal authority and royal. Greed would establish precedents that permanently altered the balance of power between church and state across medieval Europe. The compromise that emerged satisfied no one but enriched everyone involved in the conspiracy. The bulk of Templar properties would be transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, the Templars' ancient rivals who had somehow managed to avoid similar accusations of heresy. This decision appeared to preserve the fiction that Templar assets remained dedicated to holy purposes, while actually ensuring that Philip's allies would control the redistribution process. Picture the irony. The Hospitallers, who had competed with the Templars for 2 centuries, suddenly found themselves inheritors of their enemies' vast network of commanderies, farms, and urban properties. Overnight, they became Europe's largest landowners, wielding wealth and influence that dwarfed most kingdoms. Yet this windfall came with strings attached to new properties, carried Philip's expectations of future cooperation and financial support, but the official transfer to the Hospitallers masked a more complex reality of seizure and redistribution that varied dramatically across different kingdoms. In France, Philip simply kept what he wanted and transferred only marginal properties to the church. Royal supporters received choice Templar estates as rewards for their loyalty during the persecution. Urban properties in Paris and other major cities were converted to royal use or sold to fund government operations. In England, King Edward II initially proved more scrupulous about following papal directives, but financial pressures eventually overcame religious compliance. The English crown retained control of the most valuable Templar properties while making token transfers to the Hospitallers. Many former Templar estates were granted to nobles who had supported Edward's controversial reign, creating new centers of power that would influence English politics for generations. The Holy Roman Empire witnessed perhaps the most chaotic redistribution, as princes and bishops competed to seize Templar properties within their territories. The emperor's theoretical authority proved meaningless against the reality of local power grabbers who justified their actions by claiming to follow papal directives. Former Templar commanderies became bargaining chips in complex political negotiations that reshaped the empire's internal balance. But the most significant long-term consequences of Templar wealth redistribution may have occurred in places where the order's assets weren't officially seized at all. Switzerland, that mountainous confederation of relatively powerless cantons, somehow found itself hosting mysterious influxes of gold and silver that coincided suspiciously with the Templars' destruction. The sophisticated banking practices that would make Swiss cities famous throughout the Renaissance appeared with startling suddenness in regions that had previously been economic backwaters. The transformation of Swiss banking from simple money changing to international finance bears uncanny resemblances to Templar innovations that had revolutionized European commerce. Techniques for international credit transfer, sophisticated accounting methods, and absolute client confidentiality all echoed practices that the Knights Templar had pioneered. Whether through refugee knights, hidden treasure, or transmitted knowledge, something of the Templar financial legacy survived in the mountain valleys of Switzerland. Portugal provides perhaps the clearest example of Templar survival through political transformation. King Dinas refused to implement the papal dissolution, instead reconstituting the order as the Knights of Christ under Portuguese royal protection. This wasn't just a change of name, it was a deliberate preservation of Templar traditions, symbols, and presumably knowledge. The new order inherited intact Templar properties and continued operating with the same organizational structure that had made their predecessors so formidable. Asterisk, the long-term implications of this Portuguese decision would prove historically enormous. When Prince Henry the Navigator began sponsoring voyages of exploration in the 15th century, he did so as Grand Master of the Knights of Christ. The same red cross that had marked Templar shields now decorated the sails of Portuguese caravels as they pushed into unknown Atlantic waters. The maritime knowledge, navigational techniques, and possibly even maps that enabled these expeditions may have been preserved from the original Templars' decades of experience in Mediterranean and Eastern trade. The cultural consequences of the Templar destruction extended far beyond mere property redistribution. The precedent established by Philip's successful campaign against a papal-protected religious order fundamentally altered relationships between secular and ecclesiastical authority throughout Europe. Future monarchs learned that even the most sacred institutions could be destroyed if the right combination of manufactured accusations, political pressure, and financial incentives was applied. This lesson would echo through European history in the destruction of monasteries under Henry VIII, the suppression of the Jesuits in the 18th century, and countless smaller seizures of church property by cash-strapped governments. The Templar persecution provided the template for how political authority could overcome religious immunity through carefully orchestrated campaigns of character, assassination, and legal manipulation. The psychological impact on medieval society proved equally profound. The sudden fall of an organization that had seemed permanently established shattered many people's faith in institutional stability. If the Knights Templar could be destroyed overnight, what security did any powerful institution possess? This anxiety contributed to the political instability that would characterize the later Middle Ages, as people lost confidence in the permanence of established authorities. Yet, perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Templars lies not in what was destroyed, but in what survived through underground transmission. The persistent appearance of Templar symbolism in later secret societies suggests that something authentic was preserved through networks of initiates who maintained organizational memory across centuries of persecution. Whether this represents genuine preservation of medieval traditions or romantic reinvention by later groups remains hotly debated. Freemasonry, the most widespread of these alleged inheritor organizations, explicitly claims descent from medieval stonemasons but incorporates symbols, rituals, and legends that bear striking resemblances to Templar traditions. The emphasis on architectural symbolism, the use of biblical references to Solomon's Temple, and the preservation of ancient wisdom through initiatory degrees all echo themes associated with the Knights Templar. While historians generally reject direct institutional continuity, the cultural connections seem too specific to be entirely coincidental. Modern conspiracy theories about the Templars often focus on their supposed accumulation of secret knowledge or hidden treasure, but the real historical significance may lie in what their destruction revealed about the relationship between wealth, power, and political survival in medieval Europe. The order's fate demonstrated that no institution, regardless of its sacred mission or papal protection, could survive if it accumulated enough wealth to threaten established authority structures. The economic innovations that the Templars pioneered, international banking, credit transfer systems, sophisticated accounting methods, didn't disappear with their destruction. Instead, these techniques migrated to other organizations and regions, eventually forming the foundation of Renaissance commercial practices. Italian banking houses, Flemish merchants, and eventually modern financial institutions all built upon innovations that the Templars had developed centuries earlier. The question of whether the Knights Templar were guilty of the charges that destroyed them has become almost irrelevant compared to the broader historical significance of their persecution. Their destruction marked a turning point in European political development, establishing precedents for how sovereign authority could override religious immunity when sufficient wealth was at stake. The techniques used against them, manufactured accusations, coordinated propaganda, systematic torture, and international pressure, became standard tools of political repression that would be refined and employed by authoritarian governments for centuries to come. Standing today in the ruins of former Templar commanderies, walking through Swiss banking districts, or examining the symbols carved into Masonic lodges, one cannot escape the sense that the order's influence extends far beyond its official 200-year existence. Whether through preserved knowledge, hidden treasure, or simply the power of legend, something of the Knights Templar survived their apparent destruction and continues to shape our world in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. The final irony may be that Philip IV, in trying to erase the Templars from history, instead guaranteed their immortality. The mysteries surrounding their destruction, the questions about their secrets, and the romantic appeal of warrior monks destroyed by corrupt authority have inspired countless books, movies, and conspiracy theories. 7 centuries after Jacques de Molay burned at the stake, the Knights Templar remain more famous and influential than the king who destroyed them, a victory that transcends mere survival to achieve something approaching historical resurrection.